Croeso I Gŵyl Haf. Welcome to Gŵyl Haf. Today with me I have Dr. Tinash Musha Kavantu, who is a researcher, writer and postdoctoral fellow at WITS in South Africa. Amongst many things he's done, he is the founder of Reading Zimbabwe and Black Chalk & Co. Reading Zimbabwe is a blog that is a digital archive of from the 1950, I think, to now of Zimbabwean books. And then Black Chalk & Co is a fugitive collective that I will let Tinash explain a little bit more detail. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I think, like I said from your invitation, Wales has a special place in my heart. So, you know, to participate in a platform that is situated in a place that relates to me personally, you know, it's a special gift. So thank you.
Oh, not at all. I'm glad. I mean, I love Wales as well, so that's lovely to hear. Thank you. I wondered if you could sort of so before I get you to explain a little bit about Reading Zimbabwe and how that came to be, I wanted to quickly mention that you're sort of in the middle of I think what you've termed a trilogy on Dambutso Marachara, where you had the first book that came out last year, Dambutso Marachara, Notes on a Speculative Archive. Then there's a book coming out this year with Drakanda Media, and then I think there was another one in 2022 as well. And Dambutso Marachara is maybe one of the more well-known names, along with Charles Mungushi and then maybe sort of Yvonne Vera or Tsitsi Dangaremba that people might have come across before. So I just wanted to plug that in case anyone would like to go read a little bit more. So we'll come back to that in a bit. But first of all, what is Reading Zimbabwe and how did you come to start, co-found it? And what is the sort of, a lot of your research work has to do with archives and memory, so maybe you want to tie that in a little bit.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So Reading Zimbabwe is a digital platform that documents and archives information about books from Zimbabwe from the 1950s. And we chose the 1950s specifically, you know, as a symbolical beginning, because the first Black intellectuals in Zimbabwe to publish books only begin in, sorry, around 1956. So, yeah, so I think the situating of the origins of Reading Zimbabwe is important, you know. With myself and my collaborator, Nonsikelo Lomtiti, we met in New York, and we were always talking about home. We're also part of a network of young Zimbabwean diaspora, and we were always asking each other questions about our history, about our identity, about our relationship to language. And so that's pretty much the sort of the foundation of the project. But I think as we went along, the project started having its own identity, we started developing specific interests within it because we're learning so much from the data that we were accumulating over time. So I think at this point, the project has been going for almost four or now getting into 5 years. And yeah, there's so much that we've learned, so much that we've built out of the work, out of the archive itself. So ourselves as the co-founders, we are also artists, we are also researchers, we are also writers, and we decided to start using the material that we're accumulating to produce independent work. And so it's something that I'll talk about. And I mean, I guess it also forms the basis of our work as a collective, Black Chalk & Co. So yeah, I think I'll start, yeah, I think maybe that's kind of just the elementary information about Reading Zimbabwe. But yeah, it's a project that grew out of a place of neglect and necessity. Zimbabwe doesn't have a strong, at least right now, as it doesn't have a strong record keeping controls or archiving, and that is very political. So, so I think that in itself is a criticism of the current situation in the country where archives are controlled by the state because it's a way to repress certain narratives. And I think that's what Reading Zimbabwe has been slowly, I guess, slowly addressing those gaps, slowly addressing those contradictions. But I think that's the sort of preliminary information I can share about Reading Zimbabwe.
So you mentioned Black Chalk and Co, which you also co-founded with Nonsekilio Mutiti, and that is very much a linked work, and you sort of have created this. I don't know if you call it a book, but some writers can have give two heartbeats, which is sort of emphasis on being multi-generational and emphasis on sort of visual composition and writing working together. And this sort of, I watched a lecture you gave where you say that archives are a collective memory about how we see ourselves, and then they're objective, that's sort of like the beauty of archives, but it also means that they can be abused for power. And I was wondering, some writers can give two heartbeats, and Reading Zimbabwe both feel like part of that same project to archive. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about some writers can give two heartbeats.
Yeah, I mean, it's a, I mean, I wish I had a copy to show on screen, but yeah, some writers can give two heartbeats.
I'll put a picture.
Yeah, some writers, thank you. Some writers can give you two heartbeats. Is a book, I think in a lot of ways it's a performance, it's a book that brings together sort of an intergenerational mix of writers in the last 40 years of Zimbabwean literature. And how we did that was that we took extracts from interviews that Zimbabwean writers have given over time and created a wholly new collective conversation, thinking about language, thinking about the creative process, thinking about identity, thinking about politics, and many issues that affect Zimbabwean literature primarily in English. But we are also referencing to other literatures in Shona and Ndebele. And I think what makes the book special is that it was also a conversation between the literary text and sort of visual language. We thought much about the way the book looks, the way the book feels, so thinking about texture, thinking about ephemerality, the ephemerality of text, thinking about typography, thinking about all these elements, how they come together. So I mean, yeah, it's a book that I enjoyed working on. The basis of the book was a collection of notebooks that I started keeping when I was a teenager, because when I was younger, I was fascinated with the interviews that Zimbabwean writers were giving, especially in the newspapers, in our country's newspapers, in our country's popular magazines. And so I started cutting out these interviews and keeping them. And then I started fantasizing about making a book of quotations by Zimbabwean writers. But I mean, I just kept them until I took them to New York and I showed them to Nonsekilio Mutiti, and she felt that there was a good way of representing them visually. And so that's how, so in a sense, some writers can give you two heartbeats has been, at least for me personally, a lifelong project, that I've been doing for more than 20 years, that benefited from, from conversations, from just personal growth. I've been fortunate to live and study in different countries. So all of those experiences, are also kind of encapsulated in this particular book. But also, I think Nonsi's own experiences are also projected in the book in the ways that she thinks about, the visuality of language, the visuality of books. So it's a, but I mean, I think I should also, it's important for me to emphasize that it's, the book was also one demonstration of how we have been trying to think about reading Zimbabwe, because as it exists, it's only a site that provides metadata of the book. Where was the book published? When was it published? How many pages are in the book? And we're also interested in the book covers. Sometimes people write to me and say, why should I be interested in reading Zimbabwe? Why should I care about it when you are not giving me access to the actual books? But then it brings up other more important issues, issues about copyright, who owns copyright of these books? Are the authors the copyright holders, or are the marketplaces like Amazon the copyright holders, or are libraries and archives in the US and in Europe, the holders of this the copyright of these archives? So that's become very interesting. Some of the writers that are featured on Reading Zimbabwe don't even have copies of their own first books because they've been since long out of print. But when I've gone to the US, I find these books. When I've tried to negotiate to digitize these books, I'm always told to go back to the author, but the author is desperate for their book to be accessible because they also don't have a copy. So I think, working on Reading Zimbabwe has just opened so many interesting questions about copyright, about ownership, about control, about, the invisibility of especially Black intellectuals. Um, and I think what we were trying to do with some writers can give it to heartbeats was to consolidate all those voices and bring them together and kind of create a carnival experience where all these authors and thinkers, were so visible and were unmediated. So I think the most important thing about some writers can give you to heartbeats is that we reduced editorialization. So there is very minimal editorialization. We do have some notes, some marginal notes in the book, but they're only to either give context or to add more to a writer's ideas. But in essence, yeah, the book was our way of showing the possibilities of what Reading Zimbabwe provides in terms of knowledge, in terms of sort of this repressed, hidden archives that now exist primarily in the US and in Europe.
I hope to be able to interview Nancy Keelio one day about sort of typefaces and book covers. I think that's such an interesting and yeah, everything you just said was fascinating. I was wondering if you could I very much this question is now going to be about recommendations, but within the context of everything you just said about copyright and power, and actually there is something important that is not the content of the book as well. I was wondering if you could talk about some important books to you and just some books that you would like to speak about.
Yeah, I think at the very beginning you mentioned Dambudzo Marichera, so he obviously is an important writer to me personally, because he's been a subject of my research for the longest time. So I think I would recommend any of his books. He's a fascinating character, and I'm interested in him as an important intellectual voice from Zimbabwe. So I think, yeah, I'm interested in him beyond his own writing. I'm interested in his presence. I'm interested in his contributions to Zimbabwean and African literatures. So yeah, his most well-known book is The House of Hunger, but he also published two other books before he passed away, Black Sunlight and Mind Blast. But then there were also other books published after his death. So yeah, my preoccupation with Marechera is that his is the most active archive of a Zimbabwean writer. And I think there's so many lessons to draw out of it. There is also so much politics around this archive. You know, who owns it, who controls it, who has a right to interpret it, who has a right to engage with it. And I think these are very important questions to think about for me as a young Black African writer, scholar, um, thinker, because I think without addressing, those questions, I think that my work, for me at least, is futile, and I mean, I think I can connect that. So Marechera is also pretty much very present in a very pedagogical sense, in the framing of reading Zimbabwe. And I say this because one of the most important things that we've been trying to highlight is who writes Zimbabwe, where do they write Zimbabwe from? And as you see on the homepage of Reading Zimbabwe, I think right now, currently the books that we've documented are published in more than 150 cities around the world. And that's a very interesting number. So there was a way in which we were trying to present a global reading of Zimbabwe. And Marechera is a very global figure who is interested in sort of the aesthetics of literature, who is interested in the theory of literature, who is interested in the philosophy of literature. So for me, I always, you always be my primary recommendation, because it disturbs, sort of binaries, it disturbs, labels, it disturbs, sort of contexts and frames of reference. But I mean, yeah, and then, I mean, and then there are other writers, there are other writers. I feel strongly about most of the Zimbabwean writers for different reasons, but I'll just mention names. Yvonne Vera is also very important to my creative sensibility. So I also recommend all her books. I mean, one of my favorites of her books is Butterfly Burning. But yeah, Charles Ngoshi is also very important. Musaimura Zimunya, Tsitsi Dangarembwa, and these are kind of Chenjerai Hove. These are sort of pretty much our first, second generation of Zimbabwean writers who have had the most influence on our literary culture. But, there are also now my own contemporaries or my own peers, people like No Violet Bulawayo, people like Novio Rosa Chuma, Panashi Chigumadzi, and slightly older folk like Bettina Gapa, Brian Chikwava. So there's a long line of Zimbabwean writers who are doing interesting things. And the reason I mention all these writers is because of the kind of work I do. I'm interested in sort of genealogical lines that have developed over time, how themes in Zimbabwean literature have developed or not developed, and what is the relationship between this literature and the country, the politics of the country. As you may know, Zimbabwe has had a very prolonged political crisis, and I think everyone who's invested in Zimbabwe as a country, as a place, as a source of identity, is preoccupied with answers or with solutions to this prolonged crisis. And one way of locating, these answers is through fiction, through literature. And so that is why it is important for me to sort of look at Zimbabwean literature from maybe from a very holistic perspective. So yeah, I think all of these writers that I've mentioned, give you different sensibilities, the complexities of this place. Because I think sometimes what happens when a place is locked in a prolonged crisis is that it becomes predictable in the eyes of the media. It becomes a place of chaos, a place of stasis, a place of decay, a place of corruption, but we then lose sense of the complexity of the place, how beautiful Zimbabwe is, how beautiful its people are, and these are the things that I'm interested in throughout the work that I'm doing. So as I go around, meeting people, talking to people, visiting archives, interviewing writers and scholars, I think the idea is to try and locate this beauty, and what has happened to it over time. So yeah, so I mean, I think all I'm saying is, if one is interested to understand, a place and this complexity, one is to locate it in multiple voices, in multiple perspectives, and in essence, that is the kind of work that I've been doing myself.
Well, just sort of out of curiosity, what is it about literature? What was your personal relationship with literature that drew you to examining the beauty of literature as opposed to the beauty of another art form or a non-artistic pursuit of study?
I mean, I think for me, it stems from childhood. I was born in the early 1980s. Soon after Zimbabwe's independence. So I'm a product of the euphoria of the country. I'm a product of possibility. My parents um, raised me, with a sense of possibilities. The possibility to live in a suburb, the possibility to have the best education. So everything that I've achieved, that I've acquired in my life, was born out of my parents' sense of ambition, sense of possibility. Um, in a lot of ways, our country has let my parents down because they didn't achieve all the things that were promised by independence. But when I say I locate my interest in books and literature to childhood, it was because there was always reading material in our house. My mom loves reading, so my mom always had books to read. My father uh, loves the newspaper, so there was always a newspaper, current affairs. So there's a way in which my life was balanced out, by this sense of possibility that the imagination provides, through my mother's readings. And then I was also grounded, by my father's kind of reading because I had to be aware of current affairs. So there's a way in which my life has merged these two different kinds of reading, or these two kinds of interpreting the world. And these two things are very important to me. And so, yeah, I read everything in context. I'm very much interested in the circumstances of the production of Zimbabwean literature, whether in the country, whether in the diaspora, because all these factors are interconnected with the politics of possibility, with the politics of displacement that has taken place in our own country. Because a lot of younger people have had to leave because for them to, achieve, or for their talents to be recognized, they've had to go to places where people, can see those possibilities. Um, so yeah, for me, it's very personal. I think, yeah, reading is a very personal activity. But I think about it also in a very collective sense. I love my community. And I mean, going back to all the work that I've been doing, that I've been involved with, Reading Zimbabwe is about community, the community of writers, community of thinkers, community of dreamers. That is what that project is all about. Some writers can give you two heartbeats. It was a homage to a community of writers that are very dear and personal to me, whether or not I've met them. The fact of the matter is they dream and think about a place that I care about. It doesn't matter where I am. Um, so yeah, so I think it's a long answer to a very short question, but I think reading is very personal. It's very political, and the kind of work that I spent my time doing is to try and understand the relationship between the two, but also try to understand them separately. Yeah.
And of course, the language in which we read is itself very political, and Zimbabwe is multilingual, and the three main being English, Shona, and Indabella. And I was wondering, so Marachera has a sort of bit where he talks about how he didn't consider writing in Shona because he wanted to leave it behind, and English was the symbolism of leaving that behind. And then I think I'm right, he did end up writing in Shona, and certainly Mungoshi wrote in Shona. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about how those, the colonial and the other, and the Shona and Indabella relate, and the dynamics there.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think it's a very important question. You know, the question of language in the African context in general it's a very important question. We cannot, think about language without thinking about the history of colonialism, the history of exploitation, the history of appropriation, and unfortunately, I am part of a generation that has had to deal with the consequences, of that history. Because it violates sensibility, it violates my sense of being and identity, and I think, yeah, as an intellectual, these are things that I think deeply about. But I think increasingly I am interested in questioning, the sort of homogeneity that language, also forces upon us. So the impression one always has is that Zimbabwe is a country of three languages, which is not the case. There are multiple languages that have either been co-opted into these sort of three main languages, and increasingly I'm interested in questioning that sort of uniform, universal, those universal claims of the kind of the languages that we have to use. I mean, in my case, I was raised with English as pretty much one of my primary languages, and so I've co-opted it into my thinking. I've co-opted it into my being, in ways that my own father and my own grandfather cannot relate to the language, because they were either born and raised in a context that those very languages discriminated against them, and limited their choices in life. So when I look at this sort of line, this genealogical line of my own family, we all don't relate to these languages the same way, because they either evoke, painful memories, or they either evoke a sense of displacement of oneself to their own identity. And so these are things that I'm increasingly interested in, to sort of problematize these questions about language and identity, because I think it's very important. I mean, it's quite interesting, when I just mentioned I love Wales. I was fascinated to live in Wales when I was doing my master's degree, because of the sense of bilingualism, that surrounds you. Whether I go to supermarkets where there are two languages that welcomes me, or I'm driving from London or from Bristol into Wales, and there's a sign that says Croeso and the sign that says welcome. That always fascinated me. But we don't have that sense of bilingualism or that sense of multilingualism in a country like Zimbabwe, because one language is always overemphasized over the others. So you will never find signs that gives you that sense of possibility that you can be welcomed in 5 languages or in 13 languages. So there are all these like problems intellectual problems, that I am trying to engage with, that I'm increasingly interested in. Because now, for example, when people ask me, who am I? What are you? Um, um, they always ask me either I'm Shona or Ndebele, and I say I'm not. I'm neither. I'm neither of them, because I am Ndau. And then people say to me, "Oh, you're Ndau. Ndau is a dialect of Shona." But Ndau is not a dialect of Shona. It's always been its own language. And because of the way that our politics has framed these languages, every other language has become a dialect of the dominant languages. I think, what I'm essentially saying is I'm increasingly interested in locating myself in this sort of multilingual canvas of Zimbabweans, in the languages that are not visible to the rest of the world, but are visible to myself. When I visit my grandmother, she speaks in a very specific. She has a very specific accent. She speaks in Dao. So every time I have to go and visit my grandmother, I have to switch my mind to a very specific language, that I can't speak, but I can only locate on my grandmother's tongue, which is quite interesting. Um, so yeah, so language is important, But I mean, the unfortunate part is with Zimbabwe, that was also been the plan. The plan has been to locate these languages, and unfortunately, a lot of the other languages from Zimbabwe have very little written literature, very little published literature. And for me, that's increasingly becoming a concern, because it means that the more they go unwritten, the likely that they die or disappear. So I think there's a way in which the work I'm doing is also trying to recover these languages. And yeah, it's not very obvious when you arrive on readingzimbabwe.com, but as it exists, the site is more than 25 languages, because I'm increasingly interested, not just in the local languages that people speak or that people use to describe themselves, but I'm also interested in how the world reads and interprets Zimbabwe. So some of those 25 languages include, Hungarian, Japanese, Chinese, Dutch, even Welsh. So I'm interested in sort of how translation, how a country is read in translation, and what is lost or gained, out of those sort of mediated linguistic experiences.
I don't think there's so much I want to get into there. What I want to focus on is signs, I think, are so incredibly important. Like, the only word of Welsh my dad knows is gwasanaethau, which means service station. And there has been a very concerted effort in Wales to make those signs bilingual, and that was sort of symbolic of then a sort of shift that has happened in Wales. And something that I've been thinking about a lot as part of the festival is how can we centre more Indigenous languages, or languages that otherwise don't have as much written history and are maybe not best conveyed in a novel, but have been historically conveyed as an oral language, or any other form in particular. I was wondering if you had how in Zimbabwe is there much translation between languages, and sort of what would you like to see translation wise? Which directions would you like to see more work done on in?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, look, I think I think it's a very important question, but unfortunately there is very little translation, between languages in Zimbabwe itself. So what I take out of the question is that for me, it's a challenge. That is the challenge that people like myself have, how do we translate these different experiences into the other languages? And that is increasingly important to me. And I think that in some ways, that those are the kinds of challenges, intellectual challenges that we have been trying to work through as Black Chopin core, to think with these possibilities, to think with these limitations, because it's increasingly important. All the writers that I mentioned, for example, from Zimbabwe, that people can read, primarily write in English, and they are never translated into the local language. I don't think there's any of their books are translated into either Shona and Ndebele or any other language that they may identify with or speak. So that's a very important. So I think that's a very important, intellectual challenge, not just for myself, but I think for us as a country, and for us as cultural workers. I think it's something that we seriously need to think about, and that is why I mentioned my Welsh experience, because even though it's symbolical to have these bilingual signs, for me it spoke to the need, to acknowledge, that we can look at the world in multiple languages at the same time. We don't have to privilege one or three languages at any given moment. So I think, I think it's a very important provocation, that I hope another time, another day, when we have a conversation, I may have a more practical answer to give, or a more practical example to give. But at this point, no, there's no translation happening between languages. The translation that happens is external. So it is what is happening outside. So there are multiple translations of the very same writers in multiple languages in Europe, and I guess also less in Africa. So this is the thing: this problem of translation of inland or in-country translation is not specific to Zimbabwe. It is a problem that is just general to the African context. We don't translate each other. We don't translate each other's experiences. So there's something about the colonial boundaries that have closed us from each other, and I think it's a very unfortunate structural system. So it's interesting how a country surrounded by almost 5 countries not to read and understand the experiences of the people that live in the countries that surround it. So I have no sense of what happens in Zambia, in Botswana, in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Namibia. And these are like countries that all surround this, country called Zimbabwe. I think we need to do more. I think I've started seeing an attempt to redress that, especially in East Africa. So a lot of East African scholars are thinking with Kiswahili, because there's a way in which Kiswahili is a lingua franca of the Eastern African bloc. So it's spoken in multiple countries, and they're trying to find ways of translating their specific experiences and cultures into this one language that is accessible to as many people. And unfortunately, we don't have a language like that in Southern Africa that sort of unites all of us. So so I think it's an important question, but I take it as an important challenge, that I want to keep thinking about.
Me too. I hope that I can have a more concrete answer as well in the future as how to address those imbalances. In my understanding, there's some interesting work happening in West Africa around Western African countries within writing systems, and sort of all the world's most recent writing systems are all coming from Western African countries, and they're all sort of developing. So I've always found that quite interesting, and there's sort of a tension though between the written word and the spoken word, and sort of what counts as literature and what doesn't count as literature, that you very much see. I wanted to sort of touch on how this sort of relates back to your research. What are you working on currently, or how does sort of like your academic work filter in with all of these other projects that you do, and thinking about language and translation?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of those questions where I think the kind of work I do is misunderstood in the academy. So I think it's work that is discouraged in the academy, and in that in itself has been a challenge to negotiate, because it means I cannot easily get opportunities within the academy, because my kind of research in a lot of ways defies sort of the limited ways in which academic scholarship is produced. You know, for example, I'm not interested in writing academic papers that are published in journals that after my paper is published, I cannot access because my institutions in Africa cannot afford the same publications. So I actively refuse to participate in that sort of model of knowledge production. So my kind of work is happening within my communities, within my networks. And I think one of the things I've learned, you know, working through Lecture and Co, for example, was a refusal to, you know, I think a refusal, but also an active, actively choosing which mediums to work with, to work within. And I think as I go forward, that's pretty much. I think I'll have less. I'll have less of a presence in the actual academic space. I will increasingly always try to find my spaces in the margins of the systems, because they allow me flexibility. They allow me a sense of freedom that I wouldn't necessarily have in an academic institution. So yeah, I mean, I'm currently working on multiple projects pretty much all the time. And some of the projects are individual. So book projects that I can do for myself. So I've been, like you rightly mentioned, I'm working on books on Marichera, on different aspects of Marichera. And those are personal projects, you know, that are derived from my academic research. But I've also been doing a lot of editorial work. So I have editorial projects that are coming up. So for example, in this year alone, I think I have completed, you know, 4 editorial projects that are with different publishers within the continent, but also in the US, and even in the UK. But increasingly, I think I want to try and locate my publishers, or at least my publishing collaborators on the African continent, because I think it's increasingly becoming important for me that I am more visible and more accessible, you know, on the continent rather than its diaspora. Because what I've learned, you know, is that when you are published in the diaspora, your work and your ideas trickle slowly back to the people that need them. So I think as I keep working, I am increasingly thinking about publishing networks on the continent. So as I speak to you, I'm currently in Johannesburg, South Africa, and in the time that I've been here as a postdoctoral fellow, I've met, you know, incredible people, and so some of the book projects that I mentioned are all going to be published in South Africa. So for me, this is like the beginning of being intentional about where and how my work circulates in the world. So yeah, I mean, nobody can take away, you know, my academic experience, you know. So as an individual, I'm not interested in the ways the academy produces knowledge, but I'm also grateful that I have the knowledge, the skills that the academy has given me that I can employ in the kinds of work that mean something to me. And so as I keep working, I'm very intentional of where I want to be. and who my interlocutors are, and the kinds of people that I want to collaborate with. And yeah, so I think that's kind of where I am, and I think I'm also trying as much as possible to share my own knowledge and skills and experiences within my own communities, so I'm increasingly collaborating with younger people, who have interesting ideas, and I try just to show them the different possibilities of realizing their projects, or different ways of expressing themselves, especially through books, and zines, and sort of digital platforms. So yeah, so I mean, I guess there's also a way in which my work has become very much activist in that sense. I'm taking the knowledge that I have from the academy into my communities, and where possible, subvert the forms that we are forced to live in, because of just how limiting they are.
There's some sort of link there between thinking about the future of publishing and how we can increase increase is not the right word, but improve publishing and make it less Eurocentric or American centric as a sort of worldwide project, and the digitalization of publishing and sort of younger people working in digital platforms. And then I wanted to maybe link that with I think you said Hurrah is your is your muse, and that, like, does that mean for you looking to Reading Zimbabwe is a digital project, it's a digital mapping project. Does that look like similar things in the future? Are you planning on sort of staying in South Africa, or what are your sort of plans for what you'd like to do?
I mean, that's a
yes, no, no
it's,
answer expected.
it's the most difficult question to answer, but I think that I will always locate my sensibility to Zimbabwe, no matter where I am in the world. I think, I love travel, so I mean, any opportunity to be in other spaces, I will always embrace them, because of the lessons that they bring into my own life. But also, it's also about survival, the economics of survival. So I think at this point, I will always go to the spaces that give me economic security, economic sustainability, and that's just the unfortunate reality. I would love to locate permanently, locate myself in Harare, in Zimbabwe, because I care about the space, and I think that I am privileged, to have the skills and the knowledge, to contribute meaningfully to the country's, culture, especially literary culture. So yeah, but I mean, look, wherever I am, I will always go back to Harare. So I always go back. It doesn't matter which part of the planet, I work from, but if it means I have to be in Harare 3 times a year, I always do that, and that is very important to me, because that sort of active connection, with that space, can only make my work more dynamic, more interesting, more relevant. So yeah, so it will always be my muse, but I have a love-hate relationship with the space, I think largely because of the politics of the place, which has sometimes brought so much pain into my life, into my family's life, livelihoods. But I always go back. I think that, yeah. So yeah, I mean, South Africa was also an experiment. So I'm here as an experiment, how close can I be to my source of inspiration, to my source of identity? And I think it's been a very successful experiment. So I can also see myself living across the from this place that I care deeply about.
So to sort of investigate a little bit the politics of literature, you sort of were on the founding board of Writers International Network Zimbabwe, and one of the sort of other people involved in that, Bevan Tapareta, wrote an article about how Zimbabwean literature is essentially literature in protest, and sort of questions certainly got a more global audience when Cici Dangaremba was arrested whilst her book was on the Booker shortlist, so that created more press than it might have otherwise. And I was wondering what, if it rings true for you too, that Zimbabwean literature is literature in protest.
I think there are two ways to answer that question. To some extent, I agree with that position, and in another way, I reserve, full, in another way, I reserve my agreement to that, because a lot of the work, a lot of the literature that is being published, about Zimbabwe is outside the country. So it's an external literature, and that means a lot of things. That means you are far away from being kidnapped, from violence, from being censored, and all kinds of things. So I think that what I'm saying here is that that statement needs to be qualified. Who can freely talk about Zimbabwe and who cannot? So the Zimbabwean writer who lives outside the country has more freedom and flexibility and more and there's access to a much wider vocabulary to describe the circumstances in the country, whereas the writer in the country does not have the same liberties, and that is the unfortunate reality, that a lot of the writers in the country, and sometimes it creates tension between these two groups of writers, because the ones that are on the ground always feel that when international media, speaks to these writers, they always privilege the global Zimbabwean writer, because they can say anything, about what's happening in the country. So yeah, so I think it's a complicated question, that speaks to the reality of being a writer from Zimbabwe or a writer about Zimbabwe. Location matters, and it matters in the sense of how much you can be critical of the establishment, how much you can be critical of the status quo, how much you can be critical of the political structures within the country. So yeah, but I mean, I also applaud writers like Tete Dangaremba, because she is one of the most important writers to emerge out of Zimbabwe, and she lives and works from Harare in Harare, Zimbabwe, and for her to sort of go on the front line, to critique a well-known violent political system. It's very brave of her, and I wish, there were more voices like her that that can highlight what is really going on in the country. So it's not an easy answer. I think that there's more to it than just even bravery. There's more to it than bravery, than popularity. It's also a very personal thing. How political do you want to be? How vulnerable can you be? in that system, and how committed you are. Um, is it worth? Is your art worth your security, your family security? Is your art worth, um, risking everything that you have? Is your art worth risking your life? And these are very personal questions, so I can never force them on anybody. But from where I am, I embrace both sides, because I'm connected to both sides. I'm pretty much, I live in between these two spaces, and I spend a lot of time shuttling back and forth. And so I completely understand, the precarity of being a political writer in a place like Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much, Tanash. This was a pleasure. I've really enjoyed speaking to you, and can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your day to speak to us too. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for this opportunity. I think your questions, food for thought for me, and I will take them back into my practice, as a writer and as a researcher, because I think that, yeah, I need to keep thinking about language, what language speaks to my identity, to my sense of being. But I'll always be looking outward, to take lessons. So like I said, Wales has a special place in my heart, because it was my first point of contact with Europe. When I first left the continent when I was a 23-year-old. So I always look back to that experience, to that sort of exposure that I had in that place, and the possibilities that it has given me in my life. I locate some of the work and things that I do in that place. So yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me to your platform, and I will definitely keep up with the work you're doing. And it's been exciting to also just listen to the other cast of people that you've been interviewing, giving very different experiences. So yeah, thank you all for the work that you're doing.
Not at all. Not at all. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of the day. And if you want to catch any more of our festival, all the links are down below. Thank you so much, Tanash.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.